Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2088, a bill to amend the United States Grain Standards Act to improve inspection services performed at export elevators to export port locations, to reauthorize certain authorities of the Secretary of Agriculture under such act, and for other purposes.
Does the gentleman mean to call up the bill as amended?
Yes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz, each will control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2088, the United States Grain Standards Act, Reauthorization Act of 2015, and yield myself much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, for nearly 100 years, the United States Grain Standards Act has been the cornerstone of the vibrant grain trade both domestically and internationally. This law is relied upon not only by exporters and domestic shippers, but the entire U.S. agricultural sector. The law establishes official marketing standards and procedures for the inspection and weighing of grains and oilseeds, and I would like to underscore the importance this law has played in establishing value and price discovery in the grain and oilseed marketplace. Many of the provisions in this current law are set to expire on September 30th of this year. A lapse in authorization would disrupt export weighing and grading services, imposing heavy burdens on farmers, merchants, traders, inspectors, and ultimately consumers. We should not delay in passing this reauthorization. I cannot emphasize enough, it is imperative that these inspections and weighing services are provided in a reliable, uninterrupted, consistent, and cost-effective manner. To ensure that we fulfill this obligation, we must provide a safeguard to ensure we avoid disruptions in service like the one that took place last year in Washington State. The Washington State Department of Agriculture currently provides inspection and weighing services for grain intended for export at the Port of Vancouver. USDA's Federal Grain Inspection Service has delegated this responsibility to the Washington State Department of Ag. In the event that Washington State Department of Ag cannot provide services for any reason, then the federal government, through FGIS, inspectors are statutorily required to step in and resume inspection and weighing services. And that's not what happened last summer. Amid an ongoing labor dispute, WSDA discontinued services. In statements issued at the time, WSDA, the state-based program, acknowledged they withheld inspection services because of their belief that, quote, the continued provision of inspection services appears to be unhelpful and leading to a foreseeable resolution, unquote, of the labor dispute. Instead of fulfilling their statutory obligation, the leadership of USDA politicized this situation when the agency also declined to fulfill its statutory responsibility to resume inspection and grain and weighing services. Services were eventually restored, but not before significant costs accrued to all parties involved. We've worked hard to gain access to overseas markets. We're shooting ourselves in the foot when we cannot ship our products to these markets because state and federal agencies are unable or unwilling to comply with their obligations. The inability to ship our grain because there are no inspectors at a facility does a disservice to our farmers, and it harms our economy. To address this situation, we could have been punitive. In fact, there were some who would have preferred that we do just that. But that's not what we've done, and I had no interest in doing. We simply want a safeguard mechanism to avoid this situation being repeated. To do that, we worked with the State of Washington delegation, the Washington State Department of Agriculture, labor unions, grain trade industry, and USDA. What we developed was a bipartisan consensus on a workable safeguard provision. I am pleased with this work product, and I appreciate the help and support of Ranking Member Peterson, Subcommittee Chairman Crawford, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Walz, as well as representatives from Washington State, both on and off the committee, for their advice and counsel as we develop this legislation. H.R. 2088 provides a certainty to American agriculture, and I would urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too rise in support of the U.S. Grain Standards Reauthorization Act, H.R. 2088. I'd like, first of all, thank the chairman of the full committee and of the subcommittee, both of who provided great leadership, provided the necessary space to get all parties together, and then provided for a final product that meets all of the the necessary requirements that you heard the chairman talk about. I think it's well known that U.S. grain producers produce the highest quality grain in the world. It's the inspections of them, the gold standard of assuring that quality backed by the federal government that allows us to continue this trade. And I think no one here wants to see any interruption to that service. No one here wants to see any lowering of the quality that we had. And so this piece of legislation, I think, in the best tradition of the Ag Committee in this House, was a true bipartisan compromise. It was working to find working solutions that made those things happen. And I would urge my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. This is how we're supposed to do business. This honors those producers of our grain. It makes sure that business and capital flows correctly, and it makes sure that there are standards in place to ensure that our buyers of U.S. grain know that they're getting the world's highest quality product. With that, I reserve the balance of my time and yield back.
Councilor's time. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, the subcommittee chairman, for 3 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman for his leadership on this, and certainly want to thank the ranking member of the full committee as well, and to my friend, the gentleman from Minnesota, who serves as the ranking member on our subcommittee. This is a great piece of bipartisan legislation. As has been noted here, this is about 100 years since this has been signed into law, and the grain trade has thrived over that century, and the GSA has supported its evolution by providing a backbone of stability relied upon by exporters, shippers, farmers, and, of course, consumers. With the farm economy and so many of our constituents relying on the ability of grain and oilseeds to get to market, it's critical that we act to provide stability for the grain trade like we're doing here today. This legislation accomplishes that goal in the following 2 ways. Many of the provisions in current law are set to expire on September 30th of this year. A lapse in that authorization would disrupt the current grain inspections process. Therefore, Congress should not delay in passing its reauthorization. The House is getting its job done well ahead of schedule by considering this bill today, and I hope my colleagues in the Senate will act soon as well. Secondly, this legislation provides stability by ensuring we can avoid disruptions like that which took place last year in Washington State, which was alluded to earlier by the chairman. Last summer, the Washington State Department of Agriculture discontinued its export inspections amid an ongoing labor dispute. Since labor disputes do happen from time to time, this kind of situation was anticipated by our predecessors, which is why current law provides a mechanism for USDA to step in and provide inspection services in the event of a disruption. However, the dispute devolved into a political situation in which the Secretary of Agriculture declined to use his discretionary authority to maintain inspections. While inspection services were eventually restored, it's critical we avoid a repeat of that unfortunate decision. Fortunately, the Ag Committee arrived at a bipartisan consensus and found a way to avoid any future disruptions to the grain trade by giving the industry more control of its own destiny. I urge support from my colleagues for this vital legislation. I thank the committee for all of its hard work to move this bill forward, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we have no further speakers on our side. I can't stress enough our thanks for working this out. It was at times a somewhat delicate situation, but leadership from my friends on the Republican side, bringing in folks, all engaged parties in this, helped us find a great compromise. I, too, would urge our colleagues in the Senate to take up this piece of legislation, move it forward, and give certainty to those producers who feed, clothe, and power the world. And I urge our colleagues here, let's just pass this thing and get further work done. With that, I yield back the balance of our
Gentleman
time.
yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the remainder of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my colleagues' comments, both the ranking member as well as the chairman of the subcommittee. We did work in a bipartisan manner. We worked out the differences of the bill, came up with a good work product. It is worthy of the system. I would like to, again, emphasize, as my colleague from Arkansas did, we're actually getting this done ahead of time. These rules aren't out of date yet. And so I would encourage my colleagues in the Senate to follow our example and get it done quickly so we get this to the President's desk. I urge support of the bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2088 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2051.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 95, H.R. 2051, a bill to amend the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946 to extend the livestock mandatory price reporting requirements and for other purposes.
Does the gentleman wish to call the bill up as amended?
I certainly do, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise, extend their remarks, and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2051, the Mandatory Price Reporting Act of 2015. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues on the Agriculture Committee, Ranking Member Peterson, Congressman Rouser, for joining me in introducing this legislation. I'm especially appreciative of Mr. Rouser's work as subcommittee chairman and holding a hearing to foster discussions that led to this important legislation. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2051 is a bill to reauthorize the Livestock Mandatory Reporting Act of 1999. This bill, like the underlying act and each subsequent reauthorization, has been the result of dialogue and consensus between livestock producers and other industry participants. I'd like to extend my gratitude to our nation's livestock producers, capably represented by their trade associations, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the National Pork Producers Council, American Sheep Industry Association, for their hard work and dedication on this effort. We fully understand that government mandates like price reporting can be onerous, and that not all industry participants may fully embrace this program. That said, it's apparent that over the preceding 16 years, mandatory reporting has become an essential tool that allows for greater transparency and price discovery within the livestock industry, especially as the industry continues to evolve. This reauthorization contains a number of industry-specific modifications proposed by the pork producers and sheep producers. We likewise include a provision that responds generally to industry concern regarding USDA's arbitrary decision to shut this mandatory program down for several days during the lapse in appropriations that occurred in 2013, while other mandatory programs were deemed essential. Following extensive negotiation, cattlemen have opted to support a simple reauthorization without any statutory modifications. I appreciate their hard work and look forward to continue to work with them on future improvements that they may choose to pursue. Mr. Speaker, this is a simple bipartisan reauthorization that represents consensus among industry participants. I urge members to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Thank you. I do rise in support of the Mandatory Price Reporting Act of 2015. Thank the gentleman again, and Mr. Speaker, I would say let's hope that what you see is a pattern developing here. Smart bipartisan legislation passed in a timely fashion to make sure this country's business goes on uninterrupted. You heard it from the chairman. These programs are important for producers who rely on access to transparent, accurate, and timely market information. The bill makes an important change to mandatory price reporting by making it an essential government program. As you also heard, the 2013 government shutdown disrupted price reporting. This designation will ensure that if we ever find ourselves in that situation again, price reporting will continue on. This is the very least we can do for the hardworking folks who are out there. It gives our producers that certainty that will be there. It's the right thing to do. Again, it's smart, it's bipartisan, it's timely, and I would urge my colleagues not only support this, but to make this a habit in much of what we do. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, David Rouser, Subcommittee Chairman on Livestock.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the chairman for his good and hard work on this important piece of legislation. As chairman of the Livestock and Foreign Agriculture Subcommittee, in which the Mandatory Price Reporting Act originated, I, too, want to thank the stakeholders for their hard work to come together on the provisions of this bill. The mandatory price reporting was developed in response to changing markets with an increasing number of animals being sold with little information publicly accessible. As these structural changes continued, livestock producers requested that price reporting be made mandatory. Even today, livestock markets are continuing to evolve, and it was the goal and intent of the committee to bring all parties together to strike a balance that promotes fairness, transparency, and stability in the market. No one knows how to make this process work better than those directly involved, and I appreciate the willingness of these stakeholders to work together with the committee to craft this legislation. And I also look forward to working with our Senate colleagues to continue the tradition of a healthy dialogue between both chambers of Congress, producers and packers on this reauthorization, so that we can make sure that the requested modifications are executed as smoothly as possible. In closing, I would like to again thank Chairman Conaway, Ranking Member Colin Peterson, and the committee staff for their tremendous help and guidance. And Mr. Speaker, I commend this legislation to my colleagues, and I appreciate their support. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the remainder of the time. Mr. Speaker, I too want to thank my colleagues across the aisle, and as well as colleagues on the committee with me. But I also was remiss earlier in not thanking the dedicated staff of the Ag Committee that worked on the grain standards bill, as well as the group that's worked on this one as well. We're blessed. Our country is blessed to have dedicated professionals on both sides of the aisle and the committee staff, and they do a great job working together, trying to avoid the kind of partisanship that sometimes permeates this body. I want to again rise in support of this mandatory price reporting reauthorization. Remind my colleagues that this does not expire until September of 30 of this year. We're actually ahead of the curve, and would commend this process to the remainder of the House on other important issues like that. And I ask my colleagues to support the bill, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2051 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2394 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 98, H.R. 2394, a bill to reauthorize the National Forest Foundation Act and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, and the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2394, the National Forest Foundation Reauthorization Act of 2015, and yield myself such time as I may consume. The National Forest Foundation has a simple mission: bring people together to restore and enhance our national forests and grasslands. Through the foundation, we're able to leverage private and federal dollars to support our nation's great forests in a variety of ways. These include planting trees, preserving wildlife habitats, surveying streams, restoring and maintaining trails, and the list goes on. In recent years, the foundation has leveraged funds at over 4-to-1 ratio and plans to continue on this success to raise at least $125 million for forest restoration activities. Since its charter in 1993, the foundation has been essential in helping to meet the challenges the national forest system faces. Accomplishments include over 14,000 miles of trail restored or maintained, nearly 4.4 million trees and shrubs planted, more than 500,000 acres of fuel reduction completed or planned. Over 120,000 people volunteered more than 1.5 million hours with an estimated value of $34 million. Over 46,000 youth employed or engaged. Approximately 80,000 acres of invasive weeds treated. Over 117,000 acres of wildlife habitat restored or maintained, and more than 3,000 miles of streams surveyed or restored. The foundation has also taken upon itself to educate and engage the American public on the importance of our national forests as well as the natural resources found within them. It is an integral part of in keeping our national forests, such as the Allegheny National Forest in my district and dozens of other national forests around the country, viable and thriving for years to come. Simply put, the National Forest Foundation works, and this is a common sense reauthorization. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New Mexico.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania for his work on this legislation and also for his work and dedication on the Forestry and Conservation Subcommittee, which we lead together. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation. The National Forest Foundation Reauthorization Act will allow the public-private partnership responsible for the stewardship and management of our national forests and grasslands to continue. This legislation would reauthorize the National Forest Foundation's Matching Fund program. This important program brings non-federal partners and stakeholders together to keep our forests healthy and less prone to fire. In practice, this has generated more than $4 for our forests for every federal dollar invested. Now, I have seen the benefits of this program in my own district. Since 2010, the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance has received grants from the National Forest Foundation to assist the Forest Service in conducting surveys and data collection on the wilderness areas within the New Mexico National Forests. This data has helped the Forest Service combat invasive species and improve forest health in the Cibola, Carson, and Santa Fe National Forests. Our national forests are in dire need of this type of management and restoration in order to maintain valuable ecosystems and prevent devastating and costly wildfires. New Mexico, like many other states in the Southwest, has been experiencing severe drought. And as a result, we've had record-breaking fires that have burned hundreds of thousands of acres and have caused millions of dollars in damages. While we've seen some recent improvements, long-term projections indicate that drought conditions will worsen and spread to more states across the country. We must ensure that this program, which prevents costly and oftentimes irreparable damages to communities, personal property, and wildlife habitat, receives continued support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Well, I want to thank the ranking member for her leadership and support on this bill, and quite frankly, everything we do is a part of our subcommittee in agriculture. Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers on this bill, and so I would urge all members to join me in support of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2394 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.